Why are cities important? And why should we care about getting city regions right? Watch the Urban Queue to know what it takes to shape a city that works for all. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Urban Queue. Today, we are in conversation with Dr. Jessica Seddon. Jessica is Senior Fellow and Director of the Deitz Family Initiative on Environment, Global Affairs at the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale. She's also co-founder of the Institutional Architecture Lab, Senior Fellow at Artha Global, and on the Academic Council of the Indian School of Public Policy in New Delhi. She co-chairs the Global Air Quality Forecasting and Information Services Initiative of the World Meteorological Organization. She sits on the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council on Clean Air, and Jessica's career in India and in the US has spanned academic, program leadership, and strategic advisory roles focused on institutional design for integrating science into policy and social initiatives. Welcome, Jessica. It is a pleasure to have you on our podcast, The Urban Queue.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's really nice to be in conversation with you again.
So Jessica, let's start about your work, and clearly your background spans so many sectors. You've worked in environmental stewardship, innovation, tech, governance, and you've worked with a variety of stakeholders in cities globally as well as in India. So I would love to first hear about your take on what a city represents to you.
I really like the question. And I think a city to me happens to be a collection of many different people and groups in one place. But more importantly, I always look at cities as kind of the hubs of larger social and ecological systems, as almost a central place that pulls resources in and out of a much larger area. So I tend to ally with, say, Neil Brenner's concept of planetary urbanism and see the city as the hub of something that is much larger geographically.
That's very interesting. So cities as the hub of ecological systems. So of all the cities that you've worked and lived in, Jessica, which has been your favorite?
Well, I have to say Chennai. I was there for 10 years, 10 years for the most part, spent some time in Bangalore, but I still regard it as my other home. And I think in terms of cities that represent a hub or a meeting place of a larger social and ecological system, it's also very representative of that. I mean, it's part of a larger urban ecosystem that spans up and down the coast across 2 states. It's the confluence of a couple of rivers. And it's an old and very vibrant gathering place for many different kinds of people.
Very interesting, considering just it has all of these aspects and also the heat and humidity. But very interesting that Chennai is your favorite city. So Jessica, your work on institutions, which you've been engaged in for the longest time, so it sheds light on complex social and environmental challenges. And you've spent a good deal of time thinking about institutional design. So could you explain what this entails and why is institutional design important for the world we live in?
Sure. One of the things that led me into institutional design was the fact that I was trained as a social scientist. I did my PhD in political economy, and I noticed that one of the things that we do as social scientists is often look at comparative politics, at what we know about how humans work together, or collaborate or don't collaborate, but that there was a real absence of playing that kind of knowledge forward to say, what do we know about the choices that we face for the problems now and in the future? And in some sense, the way that I would characterize the whole practice of institutional design is the point that we have agency. We can't just choose all of a sudden and declare a new institution. But we do have influence. We can make choices about how to organize ourselves and reorganize ourselves. And that the way that we've organized ourselves now is really, in some ways, it's the accumulation of practice, but it's not immutable. And I think today, when you look at the kinds of technological, ecological, social things that we collectively don't really like, we have the power to change those. And that is institutional design. So in setting up the Institutional Architecture Lab, what my co-founders and I, Jeff Mulgan and Juha Lapanen, are trying to do is bring some additional recognition to the practice so that people who are institutional designers de facto may not see themselves that way yet, can find each other, can learn from each other, and that we can make better choices under some of the very visible pressures that we face now.
That's super interesting, Jessica. And I think this point about we have agency, we have control over the choices that we make, right? And I think along these lines is work that you have done in India, around sort of the economic geography approach. You were one of the pioneers of that approach, which enables a deeper understanding of India's urban transitions. And you've looked at many dimensions of India's urban landscape. And we have very different urban typologies with different levels of financial resources, capacity, production mechanisms, and general wherewithal when we compare across the urban systems. So, what key insights did you uncover in the whole India's urban transition work?
Well, one of the things, so this work spanned some of the time that I was at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Again, we picked it up again during Okapi and then continued actually with the team at WRI. And one of the things that we really looked at was how, okay, there's an official census definition of urban areas, and then there is urban-like density. And then there's the question of contiguous urban density. So if you looked at things that looked and felt and functioned like cities in the sense of being dense agglomerations of people, how much of India was urban in that sense? And what we found right off the bat, just looking at density, was that India's level of urbanization in the sense of kind of functional characteristics of settlements was much closer. It was about 78% of India lived at an urban-like density. And that has all kinds of infrastructure implications. It has implications for governance, et cetera. So one big thing is we found a real difference between the administrative geography and the economic and social geography that came from two things. One is quite high unrecognized density, and the other was cities that essentially, or towns that essentially bled into each other and created agglomerations that I think we can see the gaps in how some of these, how the infrastructure, how labor markets, how ecological surroundings are all managed or not managed holistically because of the gap between the administrative geography and the way that people have settled. So that was really the big insight and that really motivated a lot of attention to institutional design. It motivated a lot of efforts to try to figure out how do we move from where we are now, which is encoded in all kinds of public investment. It's encoded in the powers that occur to state and to urban local bodies and panchayats. It's encoded in so many administrative practices. How do we change those to something that matches the economic and social geography more effectively?
No, absolutely. I mean, the kind of institutional mechanisms needed for a 33% urbanization rate versus 78% is drastically different. So this is clearly very interesting insight. Something that we found in our work at WRI-India as well is the degrees of urbanization where we are now. And what we say we're at now is just vastly different. And that's leading to sort of all kinds of breakdowns in institutional mechanisms and governance and levels of service delivery. So that's a very interesting insight from you. But now going forward into, from urbanization to sort of our next set of challenges, which is climate change. So the world over, we're seeing challenges of climate change mitigation and adaptation unravel in ways that we hadn't thought about even just a couple of years ago. And many of these, of course, they go beyond administrative boundaries of cities and urban or rural. Like you said, a lot of the agglomeration economies. So, what kind of solutions should we be exploring, and how do we get momentum at the right scales?
That is the big question. And I think first, starting with a couple of the gaps. So one is that the way that, let's say, non-human nature organizes itself has very little to do with how humans have divided ourselves into different sectoral agencies, different levels of government, and different administrative jurisdictions. the first thing we need to do is build the flexibility for something that looks much more like a mesh government. So having the ability for, even just a starting point, having the ability for the metropolitan development authorities to function effectively as one unit across agencies, that might be one place to start. But many more cities need that kind of metropolitan scale organization than actually have metropolitan development authorities. So strengthen the ones that are there, build the ones that are not. Even if it's only around certain subjects, like around, say, a labor market or a watershed or or an airshed, even if it's only topic specific, build the flexibility for those horizontal collaborations would be a very natural, very high reward starting point. The second actually is a different kind of scale. In some ways, many cities are too large to meet people's needs at the block or the neighborhood level. And there is this other gap. So there's a gap at kind of the metropolitan or the airshed, watershed, et cetera level. But there's also a gap at the neighborhood level, at organizations that are able to say, support community solar or to support multi-building investments in sanitation or water recycling. The scale at which a lot of the new and very promising kind of socio-technical options for managing resources more effectively often lies in between the individual building or apartment block and the city. And there are some entrepreneurs who are doing a great job at sort of figuring out how to aggregate, how to find financing. But, that's a lot of burden to put on social entrepreneurs, and figuring out a more functional middle scale, I think, would be a second really important. The third is really data. It's always been striking to me how much more the collection of different public, and let's include public-minded, so NGO, public and public-minded entities know, if you added it all up, then what is recognized collectively. There is massive information fragmentation between departments, between jurisdictions, between public, private. The store of data that sits on consultants' computers, never to be seen to any other agency again, is enormous. Yet we have the tools to be able to orchestrate all of this intelligence much more effectively and in many more salient ways. So this is where I think if there were, a way, even in one city, even in a smaller city, to start doing a really good digital twin, for example, that different agencies fed into, that made the collection of interacting aspects of the settlement more visible. If there's just one demonstration, I think it would probably spark a lot more demand for that kind of intelligence. So that's the third gap, is really data orchestration to be able to take advantage of the piles of information we have, but to do something useful with it.
No, so it's interesting. And, on the one hand, you're saying basically empowered organizations, institutions at the regional level, at the neighborhood level, to kind of complement what's going on at the city level, at the individual level. And on the other hand, you're saying data. So coming to the data question, now you've been working on air quality data and science. You built and led the air quality program at WRI, and it's complex, it's multi-sectoral, cross-sectoral challenge, and of particular concern in India. Now, do you think data and science can provide solutions to this problem, or does it, go beyond that? How do we gain traction for more focused action, and who are the stakeholders?
Well, one of the lessons I've learned over the last over my career is that data analysis, charts, graphs, et cetera, are never enough. I think that's what holds up in court. That's what ultimately drives legislation. But the initiation are almost always stories, things that are of human interest, that are immediately salient, that feel familiar, that offer the promise of something better, that spark outrage. But it's the story that gets things going. One of the projects actually I've been working on with CREA University is a series of 3 stories about human interactions with water. The project started out as being could you make some movies that look like An Inconvenient Truth, the Al Gore movie, but about water? And we convinced the project team to look at fiction, short stories about different aspects of human interactions with water. They're all set in the Pulicat area. They're all with local actors. And the stories themselves are short and, in some sense, heartbreaking. And then we can motivate people to look at all of the data and to look a little bit beyond the story. But you never get attention without the story. And that's been one of the big lessons. I think it's very human.
So basically, humanizing data with stories. And just to let our listeners know, Jessica is talking about Virundhu. And Virundhu is a Tamil short film that was released earlier this year, set in Pulicat, and presented from the perspective of fisherwomen who quite literally cooks up, pretty unusual and interesting solution to the community's water stress. So no, thank you. And you were involved in this project, Jessica and Virundhu. What were some of the things that you learned from there, and what were some of the insights that you gleaned that you might want to share?
So one of the things, I have to say I learned an enormous amount from the process of moving. So Porama Roy, who had worked with me at Okapi, and I wrote a briefing note on water cycles and the hydrological cycle and how it localizes. And we put a lot of the science and the evidence together. But working with the director and there were actually two, Rahul Muralidharan and Rahul Srivastava and Rishi Chedna, who is the director, working with that team to convert a dry set of what I thought was exciting, but most people would think it was not super exciting, into stories with human faces and drama, was amazing. That's a talent that I don't have. I can't say that I learned how to do it, but I really appreciated the opportunity to watch the humanization of an environmental data story.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think more and more we're realizing the power and the need for this kind of storytelling to be able to connect sort of at the individual level, at the political level, at so many levels with different types of stakeholders. And yes, stories are powerful. And so I love that you're saying that, data is very important, but if you don't create the story, it really doesn't go far. So that's
one other thing I don't want to overplay the story. I mean, I think the stories are often the initial kind of oomph and momentum, but the follow through and the staying power of research and science and the attention to the data, that's what gives it the durability. So in some ways, I see it as it has to be more of a team effort between the stories and the data. Too many stories without data also mean that we can run off in all kinds of crazy directions, as I think there are many examples these days.
Absolutely. No, they both have to work together. But yes, stories are a great way to bring the data sort of to life almost. So, Jessica, we're at the sort of last question that I really want to ask you today is that we often find, and in India especially, that cities are making great ambitious plans, but those plans often don't translate on the ground in spirit or intent. And in the Indian context, there's also legacy, governance, and capacity, and all kinds of issues which almost seem intractable. So my question is, how do you think decision makers should address this kind of a conundrum?
If I had a silver bullet, other people probably would, and we might see a very different set of cities. But I think we're going to need a new level of collaboration and altruism that many more individuals, it's not a decision maker problem as much as it is everybody needs to participate a little bit. And I do think that if you look around and you think of the people there are many generous, altruistic people who would happily participate. And what we're missing on an institutional level is the feedback and recognition and reinforcement of that aspect of the best of being human. It is far easier to have a quarrel with your neighbor than to have the joint water management that you both have done together be recognized. And if there's a way to start that and to start that recognition of the value of collaboration, to quantify it, to have not just the stories, but also the data behind it on scales that are very tangible and close to human, I do think it would take off, because I think people are hungry for that kind of reinforcement. So that's not to pin all the responsibility on individuals, households, et cetera. I think that the institutional and the decision-making framework needs to really orient around how to recognize, reward, and build up from everybody participating a bit. There's no other way to move from the abstract plan to the specific streets. But I think some of the work that WRI is doing, I mean, on streets, for example, I mean, that makes the fruits of collaboration very visible and very tangible, and it's replicable. So can we do that for groups of buildings? Can we do that for water bodies? Can we do that across town panchayats and municipal corporations? Those are the kinds of questions.
No, that is great. And I love that you said that, because the whole, one of the points of this podcast is to bring to light the fact that really the value of collaborations and collaborations, at multiple levels between stakeholders, and radical collaborations, ones that you would have not thought of, and how do you bring that and orchestrate that better for sort of getting to the sort of human nature planetary transitions that one is hoping for and in the positive direction. So absolutely, I think collaboration and more of that and partnerships is really the key. But I think I really like the point that you said about reinforcing and bringing mechanisms to kind of essentially bring to light the value of positive collaborations instead of the negative ones that often media and others tend to latch onto and go for. So thank you so much, Jessica, for that thought-provoking conversation. I wish you the very best in sort of your multiple endeavors, the many, many hats that you're wearing, but especially on bettering institutional design for impact. So thanks again, and look forward to talking again soon.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.